Good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to this update on gender-informed practice. We're happy to have all of you with us. We've got almost 100 people online, so if you have a question, please type it in the side. This is Lorraine Greaves speaking, and I'm in Vancouver today, and joining me is Natalie Hemsing, who's in Victoria, and we're hoping that Nancy Poole and Rose Schmidt, who are also on this project, will join us from Nunavut along the way. This is our agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the project, the Trauma, Gender, Substance Use Project, of which these webinars are a part. Then we're going to review some key gender concepts, answer a few questions about sex, gender, and how they affect substances, some specific ones, and then look at some gender-informed approaches that are already happening, and moving forward, what could we be doing better? The goal of our overall project is this: to guide the further integration of both trauma-informed and gender-informed, and ultimately gender transformative practices into substance use prevention, health promotion, treatment, harm reduction, and policy across the country. And we're very pleased to be doing this project. It's 2 years, funded by Health Canada, and it includes some of the things up here on the slide. We're reviewing a lot of evidence that's out there, a lot of the training materials and knowledge products that already exist, and of course some of the public health messages. And we'll be developing and redeveloping those in order to include both gender and trauma and transformative principles in them, so that we can all move forward in recognizing these key elements of substance use. So here's the activities. We've already completed a round table in Toronto in November, and that was very instructive. We had about 45 people there, and we talked in some detail about both of the elements, trauma and gender. And in so doing, we developed some ideas for webinars coming up, and also ideas for a community of inquiry that will be starting in April of this year. And along the way, a lot of work is happening already on looking at the evidence and reviewing the material that's already out there. For those of you going to the CCSA conference in November, we'll be there doing a panel at that point, bringing everyone up to date on the first year of the project. So, the webinar series, we've had one webinar in January on trauma-informed approaches, and many of you were perhaps present. And today we're looking at gender-informed approaches. And what you see on the list there is some of the ideas that's suggested to us about future webinars, and we'd certainly like you to add your suggestions if you have any other ideas. So, diving right in, we've got a lot to do today. We're very interested in enhancing our collective knowledge in Canada about the importance of sex and gender with respect to all of the substance use response system. And we're going to be looking at all of these elements, illustrating some applications already in existence, and certainly looking at some of the details. So we're going to start with some core concepts. Sex and gender matter to health, and if some of you are researchers as well as practitioners, you may recognize this poster on the right, which is from the Institute of Gender and Health at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And it pictorially represents, in a very simple way, the two concepts of sex and gender. We often use the word gender to refer to both of these, but specifically, it's important to look at both elements, especially in the substance use field. Sex and gender both matter. Sex-related factors roughly refer to all our biological and physiological and genetic responses and features, and gender more refers to our social, cultural, economic elements that define us. Having said that, there's still a huge amount of research required to accumulate enough evidence on the health effects, treatments, and messages, and which ones work best. But in substance use, there are lots of specific ways we already know about that affect how substances are processed in the body, mechanisms, some of the consequences, and you can see there in that list, some of these are gendered. Some of the prevention issues, different risk and protective factors, how people progress to addiction or dependence, how people respond to treatment, and of course, it goes without saying how people experience reproduction, fertility, and parenting. All of these are affected by sex and gender factors. And as I said earlier, there's a lot we don't yet know in this regard. But having said that, many of you are interested in treatment or prevention, but we really do need to recall that we can't do proper treatment or proper prevention unless we have full research. And so there's a continuing push in Canada to include sex and gender across all research activities as well. And certainly the CIHR is doing its part to try and make that happen. It goes without saying as well that there are policy implications, and certainly at the moment, the current federal government is committing itself to gender-based analysis again and looking at all policies through that lens. For those of you who have a deeper interest, especially in the research part, this is a 9-minute video that you can watch at this website. And this is one of the products of the IMPART program, which was funded by the CIHR and was a training program on sex, gender, and addiction research. And it tells you in much more detail why these concepts matter. So, just taking a look at some specific substances. Some of you are working in areas with one or two or maybe all of the substances. But it's important to know that there are sex-specific responses to all of them. Alcohol use is the one on the slide, and there are more adverse effects in women compared to men with equal alcohol intake. This kind of work has been ongoing in the research literature, but it wasn't until 2012 that this evidence was translated into the very first sex-specific guidelines for low-risk drinking in Canada. And some of you will be very familiar with these guidelines. And of course, as the poster says here, it's not sexist, it's science. But it's interesting to all of us, perhaps, that this is such a recent change, even though, of course, the evidence had been in existence for some time. Here's another example. Opioids, certainly in the news a lot these days, and certainly a really critical problem across the country. And here on the right are just some of the things we know about sex differences and gender differences. More men are implicated in opioid misuse, and more men die. But this gender gap seems to be closing a little bit. So that's one of the reasons why we need to stay on top of these kinds of trends. This is a piece that we did quite recently at the Center of Excellence for Women's Health, summarizing the risks to women of prescription pain medication. So again, this is something you can look up and see just exactly what some of the sex and gender issues are. Cannabis, the environment surrounding legislation and regulation of cannabis is shifting very, very quickly in Canada, and researchers are scrambling to catch up here to try and figure out exactly what the implications are for women and men and how this affects health. And certainly these are some of the things we know already. Suffice to say, the evidence on cannabis and health and sex and gender is fairly scattered at the moment. And as a result, a soon-to-be-published resource, The Start in Ontario, has this title, Be Cautious, Cannabis and Fertility. And certainly reviewing the evidence on this particular aspect of cannabis use certainly leads us to that conclusion. And last, tobacco use. There has been quite a bit of work done on sex and gender in tobacco, and here are some of the findings. Suffice to say, though, despite the fact that we know and have known some of this for quite some time, tobacco control is fairly sex and gender blind still. And so we still have a lot of work to do in translating some of this evidence into more sensitive policies and more sensitive programs like cessation programs. And here is one resource that really reflects on the gender elements of smoking, in this case during pregnancy. And instead of just giving more health tips and quick tips, it actually dives into the couple dynamics related to the issues of tobacco reduction during pregnancy. So this is an example of how gender relations and power imbalances are reflected in a resource. Makes it very realistic for women and men who are attempting to deal with tobacco use during this period of their lives. And this is a piece that we did in cooperation with the FACET group at UBC. So there may be some questions here, and Nancy may be with us by now from
I am, Corinne. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me, Corinne? Excellent. Well, we are here in Iqaluit on a beautiful, beautiful, sunny, crisp weather day. So the questions so far have been lots about interest in the trans piece, but this last one, which we will get to, as promised, both in this later in this webinar, but also in the project. But this last one here, this question is about has the research explored what aspects affect differences between male and female bodies? Is it muscle mass and fat distribution, brain differences, hormones, etc.? And we definitely do know that it's all of the above and more, but you may want to say a bit more about that.
Yes, it is all of the above and more, and it's also genetics. So this area is actually rapidly developing. And I think we're learning much more about all of these particular elements. But it's interesting because when we say sex-related factors, as you point out in this question, it includes many different things. And it also allows us to begin to think about how the physical body is part of the response, whether it's named male or female. So what I mean by that, and we'll delve into that in a minute, is that sex and gender categories are very fluid. So someone could, for example, have muscle mass of a certain amount and could be labeled male or female, and of course these categories can overlap. So it's not two binary categories at all. It's a continuum for all people.
There's another thing. Yeah, there's another thing here about the gendered issues around weight and smoking that you might want to say something about.
Yes, well, weight control has been investigated. In other words, the link between whether or not women in particular smoke to limit their appetite and control their weight, and whether or not this is also a factor that prevents women or reduces their interest in quitting. All I can say is that research is ongoing. There is some evidence in some studies that this is true and other evidence that it's not. And I think it's something to think about, it's something to talk about, and it's certainly at the client level something a lot of people believe in. The overall evidence seems to indicate that if you do quit smoking and you are a female, you generally gain about 5 pounds in the next 12 months. But the message, of course, is that that 5 pounds is a much healthier outcome than continuing to smoke. So let's do more on sex and gender, and I think this will reflect on some of the questions we're seeing here. Gender has many components, and I think it's really important for all of us to take a little look at this diagram and begin to think about the fact that these aren't, as I just said, two categories. These are many elements of gender. We have a gender identity, which is about our feelings of who we are and how we represent ourselves, and whether or not it's congruent with what we were assigned at birth. On the next quadrant, we have our gender roles, and these are the expectations that are determined by our society, our family, our culture, and of course they limit our opportunities to some extent. And then, of course, there's gender relations, and this is a reflection of how we interact with others, especially others who are of other genders, and whether or not power is differently distributed between them, which it generally is. And then the institution. This reflects the power of the law, religion, government, education, and all those things that affect us, in some cases quite dramatically, through giving or deleting opportunities. So this is a big slide in some ways. It should cause us to think about the fact that gender is not just a straightforward thing. It has many components, and it intersects and interacts with sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic status, and many other elements of our life experience. So the questions that emerge are reflecting the fact that the gender binary is increasingly questioned, rejected, or expanded. And many of you will be aware of that in not only the populations you may be serving, but also just in public discourse at the moment. This has huge implications for research, treatment, and prevention. And some of you may already be deep into this area and trying hard to produce services that are sensitive and knowledgeable, recognizing, as it says on the right, sex and gender are very fluid categories. And by that I mean there are cultural definitions of gender, such as the indigenous two-spirited concept, or the Hijra in India. These are age-old categories that expand the binary considerably. And certainly there are lots of gender questioning people. Some transitioning, as you will know, which can be surgical or hormonal. It can be social, legal, or biological. It is in no way the same for everybody. And then, of course, last but never least, the attitudes to LGBTQ shift over time, only in some places, not in every place. Luckily, Canada is one of those places where there's a lot more openness and acceptance. So I think we have some opportunities here to be on the forefront of exploring these matters and how we provide treatment and how we do research. So some of the questions and implications just from this very brief overview of some of the developments and concepts around gender is, how do we serve all genders in treatment settings? How do we reach all genders in prevention? And in terms of harm reduction, how are our approaches specific to all of these categories? And in research, of course, you can imagine the complex challenges in research to both investigate sex and gender in these matters. So those are, I know, some of the sort of complicated elements of gender, and I will say that these are always emerging and being redefined. I see some questions about LGBTQ and its inclusivity. It's not necessarily the most inclusive term. There are many, many, many other gender categories being suggested. Certainly that's going to differ depending on what kind of setting or environment you're in, or even what kind of location you're in. We're going to talk next about some examples of gender-informed approaches that are already in existence. And Natalie Hemsing, who has done a lot of the work on reviewing some of these materials in the gray literature and the academic literature, is going to describe them. And we certainly welcome any suggestions or pieces of research that some of you may have found to be sent to us as well, so we can compile the best possible set of resources for this project. So, Natalie.
Thanks, Lorraine. So here are some examples of gender-informed treatment guidelines that were developed by SAMHSA in the USA. So they've developed, as you can see, one here for women and one for men. And for example, the one for women includes some core principles for gender-informed treatment, such as addressing trauma, acknowledging women's roles as caregivers, and thinking about how gendered roles impact attitudes towards women who use substances, so particularly pregnant women and new mothers. And this here is what commonly comes up both in the gray and the academic literature as an example of gender-responsive treatment. It is helping women recover, and it was developed by Stephanie Covington. And it has been kind of blended with a trauma-informed approach. So the Helping Women Recover, it includes modules to address self-esteem, relationships, and myths and realities about motherhood. And it's offered together with this other module, Beyond Trauma, to address the links with trauma. And it's a 17-session group format. And you can see here that it's been tested in a variety of correctional settings, and they've produced some favorable results. There's been an improvement in trauma symptoms, depression, lowered substance use, when it's compared to standard mixed gender treatment programs. So these are some of the guiding principles for gender-responsive treatment developed by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So they identify some key principles, including creating a safe and respectful environment, building on relationships, providing comprehensive, integrated, and culturally relevant services, addressing women's economic and social conditions, and also establishing a system of community care. And this is an example also developed by Stephanie Covington that was specifically for men. So it's about addressing the specific issues related to men's trauma, such as men's silence around abuse, male socialization, and how this impacts men's responses, and risks of victims becoming abusers. And it isn't specific to substance use, but it has been pilot tested in a range of settings, including in a recovery setting. And they haven't yet published on substance use outcomes, but they're finding that men are reporting back favorably about their experience in these and their opportunity to connect and open up with other men who have experienced similar things. Example of a healing approach in Indigenous settings, and this comes from a study led by Colleen Dell from the University of Saskatchewan. And so they were examining the healing journeys of Aboriginal women who are drug users who are in conflict with the law. And they looked at the role of identity and stigma in women's healing journeys. And so you can see this fact sheet here. It highlights some of the roles that providers can play and some of the various opportunities to women in treatment and meet their specific needs. And this is PRISM. So this is a service available from Vancouver Coastal Health for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and two-spirit communities. And it's not specific to substance use, but it does address social services in general. And they offer referral services for clients. They provide education, workshops, and training for service providers and also for the community and service users. And they also offer an online community of practice that social service providers can join. So this here is just a listing of the Vancouver services that are currently available, and just to show who they're open to. So you can see that some of these are women-specific, some are open to LGBTQ community, some are open to all genders. So this isn't necessarily how gender-informed work should look or should be done, but it's just to show how treatment services in Vancouver are already trying to respond to this in different ways. This is an example of harm reduction from the academic literature. So this was a qualitative study with women in the downtown east side, where they were asked to identify some of the core components of a women-centered harm reduction-based addiction recovery program. So you can see on the slide some of the core components that came up. And, you know, women talked about their preferences for women-only group work. They talked about their need for facilities to accommodate families. And they spoke a lot about safety, both in their relationships with counselors and also in their environment. So one idea that came up over and over again with the women was the need for sort of a rural, nature-based, holistic services that could provide women with a safe space that was separate from, you know, the urban areas where their drug use was typically focused. And these are a few examples, again, from the academic literature of prevention approaches. So the first is from South Africa, and it was aimed at substance use and risky sexual behaviors in youth. And it was doing this by promoting leisure activities and also engaging youth in thinking about gender norms and how these create or constrain opportunities for leisure time. And they found, the outcomes, they found that the intervention actually reduced the uptake of alcohol and cigarette use in girls and their amount of perceived leisure opportunities, but they did not find this for boys. So it's interesting, the authors suggest that in South Africa, because girls are experiencing more interpersonal constraints and more pressure on doing chores and engaging in activities, they may have more social pressure in that regard, and boys are more exposed to substance use actually in the leisure activities they engage in, like in community sports. The other, second example is a web-based drug abuse prevention program, and it's specifically for girls, and it addresses issues such as depression, self-esteem, stress, healthy body image, and it has not been evaluated yet, but it is tailored towards girls. So there are, for example, there's a module that teaches girls about how to critically analyze like alcohol and cigarette advertisements. The last example there is from Sweden, and this was not specific to substance use, but they aimed to reduce stress and anxiety, and they talk about the links that this does have with substance use, of course. And it was a body awareness and mindfulness approach, and they found that girls reported being empowered by the group and also reported improvements in a variety of stress symptoms. And these are some of the peer support approaches. So the 16 Steps from CASEL is a group empowerment model that's designed as an alternative to 12 Steps programming. Van Du in the downtown east side, which offers peer support programming by former and current drug users. And there's a woman's way and a man's way through the 12 steps, which are manuals which are being developed by Stephanie Covington that take a look at the 12 steps and kind of reframe these for women and men who've experienced trauma.
Well, thank you, Natalie. While we digest all of this, which is a lot, it's probably worth reflecting on the fact that the arena or the climate of introducing sex and gender to research and treatment and prevention is rapidly changing and constantly changing. And one of the things that we've been investigating for the last 3 or 4 years in some detail is the notion of gender transformative approaches to responding to not just substance use, but in our work in a lot of different health and social issues. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about how we might challenge ourselves to actually raise the bar and not just include sex and gender, certainly not just stop there, but also to think more deeply about gender transformative approaches that really have 2 goals. In the case now, we'd be thinking about how can we both improve our treatment of people with substance use issues and at the same time improve their gender equity, no matter what gender identity they may have or present or what sex-related characteristics they may have. And interestingly, because gender inequity has been traditionally so focused on girls, women, or feminine people, and also on LGBTQ populations, a lot of the focus has been on changing negative gender norms and engaging men and boys in addressing those things so that empowerment can happen at multiple levels. So this is, I think, a deceptively simple concept, gender transformative work, but it is quite challenging because in substance use, we would have to step back and not only include sex and gender in our work, but also equity. And of course, the generic problem is one that we suffer from in substance use field a lot. There's a lot of talk and research and writing and programming about youth or participants or patients without attending to sex and gender-related factors at all. And this has been an ongoing problem in the substance use field. And at the same time, we have not, as is true in many fields in health, addressed the root issues and root solutions that might be necessary in order to proactively and in some cases react positively to substance use. And so we've got a couple of problems in this field, one the generic problem and one the ignoring often of root causes and root solutions. And there are plenty of reasons for that, but I think it is a challenge that we can set for ourselves to try and figure out how we can rectify it. So just by way of a quick definition, gender transformative work tries to examine and change rigid gender norms and imbalances as a means of reducing health, of reaching health and reducing gender inequity. So this, as you can see by the definition, gender norms affect all of us. It's not just about men and women in categories, and it's not just about improving the lot for women and girls. It really is a question of examining the gender norms that affect all of us. And here's a very complicated looking but useful little table that some of you may have seen before. This was included in one of our last books called Making It Better, which is all about gender transformative health promotion. And if we just look at this for a minute, you can see that across the top in the black, there are various ways in which our substance use response system could go. We could be gender blind, for example, which just ignores gender norms completely. We could be gender sensitive or gender specific. And many of our services are probably in those 2 zones now. Or we could strive to be gender transformative, which is what I have just been discussing, where we'd actively address 2 goals at once. And you can see that in some cases, if you look at the bottom, if you're gender blind or gender unequal, you may indeed be using approaches that exploit negative gender norms and in the middle, accommodate them so that you can provide what we would call sensitive service. And on the right, actually try and change them in doing what you're doing. So there's kind of a lot to absorb in 2 minutes, but it is something that you might want to look up, and I'll give you the link at the end of the presentation about where you can go to actually do a little training program on this particular approach. So here's some examples from the substance use field of campaigns, in this case, that have been exploiting gender. And you can see probably that they're kind of negative. They offer, on the right, responsibility or pin responsibility entirely on that woman, that headless woman with the beer bottle, in a fairly blaming way. And on the left, you know, a very old campaign from the American Cancer Society, which really indicated both ageist and sexist feelings at play there and trying to get a message across about smoking. This one's much more recent, and it's accommodating gender. This is in conjunction with the low-risk drinking guidelines, and it says on the left, you wouldn't go to a job interview wasted, would you, with a young man, and on the right is a young woman on about a first date. So on one level, you could say this is sex-specific or gender-specific, and that's good, but it may be reinforcing gender stereotypes as well. So the question is, how can we more deliberately be gender transformative? And, you know, in this picture here, you'll see healthy babies need everyone's support. Alcohol and pregnancy don't mix, which is a more elevated approach to the prevention of FASD in that it clearly states this is not just a woman's responsibility, but is one that perhaps could be shared. And that is a step in the right direction. This one is something that is specifically aimed at what men can do to help in this particular area of FASD prevention. And so this is going right to the notion of how men can change some of their behaviors and attitudes in order to be supportive and share responsibility. And this one goes even broader and talks about how an entire community can share responsibility for the prevention of FASD. Again, saying, please don't drink alcohol during pregnancy, healthy pregnancy, healthy baby, healthy nation, with a picture, obviously, of a group of people sharing that responsibility. So I think you can see just in these brief examples how gender transformative approaches might broaden our thinking and also include equity goals at the same time. And certainly this has a lot of benefits for men and boys. Lots of people have recognized over the past 2 decades that men and boys experience rigid gender stereotypes, obviously in different ways than women and girls, but all at the same time are limiting their freedoms as well. And in fact, Promundo, who some of you may be familiar with Promundo, is one of the best-known agencies worldwide for addressing issues around men in a way that addresses these norms, these attitudes, these values in ways to both liberate men from them and at the same time to improve gender inequity by shifting attitudes about issues such as gender-based violence and issues such as reproductive care, caregiving roles, and of course HIV and transmission. So there are much of this work has taken place in countries other than Canada and the USA, mostly in countries, 20 countries actually, that have, such as Brazil, India, some work in Mexico, lots of work in South Africa, countries where they have often been faced with more immediate and dire health considerations or health concerns, such as HIV transmission, that had to be addressed in new ways. This is an example from Promundo. They started out addressing men and men's programming, and also then developed programs for women, and also then developed programs for individuals who had diverse gender and sex identities. All of these things are connected, because when you destroy negative gender norms for any of these groups, all groups benefit. And we call this gender synchronized work, and it might be an idea that some of you could use in some of your work. This one's in North America. We direct you to the truechild.org if you're really interested in understanding some North American examples of how gender transformative work can be done. And as I say, this work is in a lot of different areas. The substance use field really needs to catch up and do way more gender transformative work. So just in taking a minute here to think about your stance, and is it both gender and equity sensitive? Does it aim to both improve health and equity at the same time? These are tough questions for some of us in services or in prevention or in promotion, when we're often funded to do one thing and not necessarily think about root causes. But these are questions to think about, and certainly will improve what we do. Nancy, are there any questions?
Yeah. Well, I'm just sitting here in a room in Iqaluit with a lot of people who have been talking this morning about how we do gender, culture, and trauma and substance use all together, and the challenges of making that really specific to the realities in Nunavut. So I think it really, it really underlines what you're saying, that we can do more than one thing at a time, and in some ways it's, that idea of multitasking and multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral is really it's really interesting and takes a bit of hard thinking. There were a couple of pauses this morning as we sat at the table about how does that fit for women in prison, even though there's very few of them in prison in Nunavut, et cetera. So, it's a lot of thinking that I think is really really interesting for us to do. But I feel such interest from a lot of really varied locations, such as the one we're visiting here today.
Well, thanks, Nancy. I appreciate that. I see a question or comment saying, I love this term, gender transformative. So strengths-based and values-driven. So that's a great comment, actually, because I haven't explicitly said that it's strengths-based, but it certainly is. And not just at the individual level, but also at the family, couple, community level as well. And definitely values-driven, because it forces us, as Nancy just mentioned, to address the context we're in, to try and figure out what root causes are, and to not ignore those when we're dealing with substance use issues. So we'll have another few minutes at the end for questions, so keep them rolling in. But I just want to talk briefly to end this about moving forward. What do we do with all this complex stuff about sex, gender, and gender transformative thinking? Not only is perhaps new to some of you, some of these nuances, but I've also said it's rapidly and constantly changing. And so it's easy to be overwhelmed. But coming back to our realities, our project is intending to merge gender and trauma-informed approaches. And this is a very old picture that we have used a lot in our work, but it drives home the fact that substance use issues and mental health issues and gender-based violence and trauma are all overlapping and interconnected and affected by many of the external topics listed here. So ultimately what we're trying to do is not bring in a whole new approach that's called gender and gender transformative, but to merge it with our existing work. And that's one of the things that this project is trying to encourage. A couple of examples. This is something we did recently to really retrain or offer training to practitioners about helping women quit smoking. And it's just an example, but it elevates the discussion about this topic away from the individual into a harm-reducing, women-centered social justice orientation. And for any of you who are working directly with populations, you'll know that this is the reality, and particularly on tobacco use, that a lot of other issues come into it, whether they be violence or poverty or stress or caregiving issues, trauma, and to actually just consistently and repeatedly address quitting smoking as if it's a generic activity is no longer very useful. Similarly, there's a chapter in a book that Nancy and I did with CAMH a few years ago now, where this chapter was about creating such opportunities for men that were male-specific and male-sensitive, but also trauma-informed, to try and deal with some of the elements of strengths-based connection and skill building and safety, familiar concepts in the trauma world, but specifically doing that with men. So I encourage you to read that, especially if you're dealing with men in treatment and are facing some of these complex issues. And this is quite old now, but it is a training guide, again, aimed at practitioners, and it's quite lengthy. It's out of Iowa, providing curriculum for practitioners to respond more adequately to LGBT issues and substance use. And it has lots of good ideas in it. I will say, though, that overall we found very little in this area that's current, and we do feel that a lot more work needs to be done on gender fluid, non-binary, transitioning issues as they reflect substance use. So, winding down here, there are some fact sheets available for you that, again, come from the IMPART program, and we'll provide that website. It's right there, addictionsresearchtraining.ca. And we created these fact sheets as well as the video that I showed you earlier, as well as a book called Transforming Addiction, if you're interested in reading about some people who have tried to look at a transdisciplinary approach to addiction. So there's loads of resources on this website that some of you might find useful as you begin to improve your responses and increase your learning about elements of substance use treatment and prevention and harm reduction, and looking at some of the overlaps with some populations such as youth. And finally, at the bottom there is another website, Promoting Health in Women, which, despite its title, actually addresses gender transformative work and training. And this came from another project where we published the book, Making It Better, which is about gender transformative health promotion. However, it includes a training program that's an online course that you can take and begin to understand and play around with some of these concepts a little bit more deeply about what gender transformative work would look like, not only in health promotion, but how you might make that happen in your area of whatever section of work you're in, treatment, prevention, peer support, policy development. And last but not least, brand new book that is being published next week called Gender Unchained, Notes from the Equity Frontier, which is a reflection on the smashing of the gender binary and what the implications are, certainly not just for substance use field, but for all of us in health and equity. And all of us who worry about where we're going next, how we deal with gender and gender inequity, and how we might all be part of the solution in leading a way forward to reduce gender inequity of all kinds. So we're very excited about that, and we hope that you'll look that one up as well. So we've got about 5 or 6 minutes here to have some other discussion. Nancy, are there any comments from your end there?
Well, there's lots of comments unfolding around, you know, just grappling with the idea of trauma and gender and equity all together. And really good questions about, do each gender experience trauma in the same way, which, of course, isn't as wide as that, although there are some kinds of themes that we would see by gender. And if you wanted to actually flip back to that slide about men and trauma responses, yeah, it kind of gives us a little bit of a sense of how people might both experience trauma differently by gender, and because of gender socialization and a whole bunch of other issues may seek help differently, may need to be approached differently in terms of inviting collaboration multiple times in order to hear it, et cetera. So, of course, it's not as simple as each gender will be exactly the same in their experience of trauma, but lots of thinking about how do we both, move along that slide you showed, about being gender sensitive and then moving to the end of being gender transformative and actually thinking about how do we both understand these things and move forward so that our response promotes equity at the same time as achieving the work on trauma and substance use. So, really interesting challenges, I guess, that we face.
Yeah, there's lots to be done here. I think the question's a great one. I also see another question about, gender and equity and, which one takes precedence. And, I think that's the beauty of the gender transformative approach, is that I think we force ourselves to think about both of them together and force ourselves to think about gender equity across the board, because it takes different forms for different groups of people depending on how they identify or how they're perceived by others. And so it is useful and also very challenging as we move out of a gender binary world. It forces us into this discussion, I think, to try and figure out how sex and gender impact us, whether or not it's in the trauma area, whether it's on substance use, whether it's on violence, whether it's on discrimination, whether or not it's earning power, whatever it is, and then try and work with those realities in our responses to substance use. So it sounds complex, and I think to many it is. And I think it's a challenge for us as we move into this whole new region of gender theory and the application of gender concepts. So I recognize some of your questions are already struggling with that. What is the focus? How will we include these things? You know, what do we do about bringing forward gender inequities that affect men and LGBTQ persons and transgender persons? I think these are the questions of the day.
Yeah, and you know, it's so interesting, that it can feel like more work, but I think it's also in some ways kind of restful in the sense that we're not trying to push everybody into a really narrow box in a way that is kind of frustrating because it's ultimately ineffective. And when we actually think wider, I feel like a lot of service providers have said their shoulders have gone down with it instead of up with the weight, because it's actually more realistic to what's in front of you and gives you more options for talking about, you know, what's important to this person and what do they want to take precedence in their journey forth. So it's not always us deciding that substance use is the most important issue. Maybe daycare is, right? And it gives us more room to see that as a method that's worthwhile.
That's right. And I think, you know, as we close, perhaps the final comment is this kind of material forces us, first and foremost, to no longer be generic in our work. It's not the same for everybody, even on a biological level. And secondly, forces all of us to think about what some root problems and root causes are of substance use, misuse in particular, and what some of the root solutions might be, and for all of us to take some interest and responsibility in addressing both of those things, the non-generic and the root solutions. So we are virtually out of time. I want to thank all of you for listening today. There's been almost 150 of us online today. This recording will be available, and these slides. This is, as I said at the outset, webinar number 2 in a series, and we certainly want your suggestions for going forward, not in just webinar subject areas, but also in the community of inquiry that will be starting in April. That gives us an opportunity for interested persons to join us in much more in-depth discussions. And I notice one of the questions at the very end here, any resources for working with trans or non-binary populations and individuals. I would say that will be the subject of one of our webinars or a community of inquiry going forward, because that's a very frequent question these days and one that needs some serious thought and investigation. So stay tuned on that. Again, thanks all of you for joining us. Please stay tuned into our project here. We're very excited about this project and hope that you can not only join us in future webinars, but also look into some of these resources that we've mentioned today. Thanks a lot.